Welcome to my lecture series on Middle East political science. I'm Dr. Bafano. This is going to be my 10th lecture in this series, and the topic for today are the origins of pan-Islamism. So you might associate this movement with groups such as the Muslim Brotherhood, for example. So we're going to learn all about the origins of this ideology, where it came from, and the social movements that promoted it. So let's just turn to my screen here. And we're going to get this slideshow started. All right, so if you've been watching the previous couple of lectures, you'll know that we're on a unit called modernization, right? So we're understanding the Middle East transition to the modern world and the challenges that came with it. In previous lectures, we discussed the emergence of modern Europe and the impacts it had on the Ottoman Empire and the Qajar Empire in Iran. We also discussed as well the emergence of defensive developmentalism and the kind of responses that those empires had to Europe to try to modernize, to invest in industry and education and a modern military, as well as the struggles with doing so. We also discussed the beginnings of European imperialism in places like Algeria and Egypt and the building of the Suez Canal. And finally, last lecture, we talked about social movements and why they emerged. We talked quite a bit about the emergence of modern cities in the Middle East, the emergence of the printing press and the spread of literacy, the growth of middle class, and finally, the development of liberalism, right, and the spread of democratic ideals amongst some social movement activists. Now, in today's lecture, we're going to point the focus at pan-Islamism, and we're going to try to understand what exactly it is. So in the process as well, we're going to try to understand the factors that led to its emergence in the late 1800s. What were the socioeconomic and political conditions that made this movement possible? And finally, we're going to discuss the impacts it had on the region before doing a kind of final review of modernity in the Middle East by specifically looking at the case of Iran. All right, so social movements and pan-Islamism. So what exactly is it? Well, Islamism is a bit different from the religion of Islam. So we learned in a previous lecture, the religion of Islam is belief in the five pillars, right? The belief in one God and Muhammad being the last prophet, and the practices that are common amongst Muslims, such as giving to charity, pilgrimage to Mecca, and so on and so forth. Islamism, in contrast, is a social movement ideology. Islamists are people who believe in the mixing of religion and state. In other words, they want their religious beliefs to impact the government, the laws of the government. And of course, they want conservative religious values to shape the law codes. In the case of Muslims, this means Sharia. So an Islamist is not the same as a Muslim, right? Someone who believes in Islam. Some Muslims are secular. They don't believe in the separation. They don't believe in the mixing of church and state. So, of course, we have this in the United States, right? So we have some Americans who are Christian, but they don't support the mixing of church and state. We call these people secularists, whereas others do. And in many ways, you could think of Islamism as a counter-reaction to the emergence of liberal social movements, such as the young Ottomans that emerged in the late 19th century in the Middle East, groups that were promoting democracy, European values. Many Islamists rejected many of these values because they brought with it secularism, right? And in feminism, things that challenge traditional Islamic values. So, like a typical social movement, these movements have grievances, things that they identify as problems. So, for number one, just like the liberals, right, they were opposed to colonial rule. So they were against French colonial rule. They were against what the British were doing in Egypt in the late 19th century. But at the same time as well, they are opposed to many of the values that came from Europe. They felt like it was destroying Islamic culture. There was this fear that as many Muslims, as they received a European style education, would lose a sense of their identity. They would stop going to the mosque. They would stop praying 5 times a day. And thus, there was this fear, right? These people would end up going to hell. So, and of course, as typical, anytime, one culture kind of starts to integrate with another and interact with another, it does lead to a kind of blowback where many people fear that there's going to be a sense of a loss of identity. So those are the grievances these people had in the late 19th century, those who are going to embrace this ideology. Now, just like social movements as well, they're going to promote solutions to these problems. So one, Islamists saw that the solution to European imperialism was to call for the political unity of the Islamic world across Sunni Muslims, Shia Muslims, and other Islamic groups, right? So calling for this kind of political unification to withstand European influence and to avoid divide and conquer. Now, on top of that as well, these Islamists rejected secularism and called for Sharia law. For example, they rejected the Ottoman Tanzimat reforms that called for religious toleration and equality between Christians, Muslims, and Jews. They wanted the people of the book to continue to pay those higher taxes, for Christians and Jews to continue to pay higher taxes. So they called for the imposition of Sharia law. This is Islamic-based law that is based on the Quran and the Hadith, that is the sayings and doings of the Prophet Muhammad. Now, here's the thing, though. Unlike, say, the caliphs of the past and the different tribes and slave soldiers that supported them, these Islamist movements relied on modern tactics and technology. You see, Islamists in many ways reflect modernity, even though they are trying to defend traditional values. These movements use protest tactics. They created newspapers. They wrote books and mass published them using the printing press. Many of them as well are going to rely on modern military tactics. They're going to adopt modern means of warfare. And more recently, you've got groups like ISIS, terrorist groups that rely on things like the use of Facebook and Twitter to be able to spread their messages. And on top of that as well, other Islamist groups have even called on participating in democratic systems to win elections and then from there enforcing Sharia law once you come into power. So many of these groups actually do call for the mixing of modernity with traditional social values. And of course, a social movement cannot exist without urbanization and modern technology. So just like the liberals, they represent really a mix of the past and the future. Now, there are, of course, as well, some divides within this social movement. Not all Islamists are alike. Some Islamists, for example, would go on to support democracy. Even though they're opposed to secularism, some Islamists are going to support participation in free and fair elections. For example, the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt after the 2011 revolution participated in elections and actually won the presidency in 2012. In Turkey, Erdogan's party, the Justice and Development Party, participated in elections. So there are some Islamists that have participated in the democratic process, but others have rejected this. So ISIS, for example, supports the return of a caliphate, the return of an absolute monarchy that will rule the entire Islamic community. So not all Islamists think alike. Furthermore, Islamists come from various parts of the Islamic world, and not all of these Islamist social movements get along with each other. Some are Salafis, and as you remember, Salafis have a very narrow-minded traditionalist mindset, a very intolerant sort of mindset towards change. Whereas Sufi Muslims, the mystics, right, they're more open to change and they are more tolerant of outside groups. And of course, we also have Shia Muslims as well that have their own perspectives on the world. So Islamists are not united across the board. They have a lot of different perspectives. Now, one of the most famous and arguably the founder of Islamist social movement ideology is a man named Jamal al-Din Afghani. He came from Western Afghanistan. He was born in the mid-1800s. He himself was a religious cleric. So unlike the middle-class reformers, many of these founding intellectuals within Islamism are going to be ulama, the traditional religious class, seeking a way to try to respond to the modern world. And so as you can see with Afghani here, is wearing the traditional turban. He's wearing the galabiya, this traditional Islamic dress. He is not dressed like a middle class reformer, liberal reformer. He's not wearing a suit and tie here, right? And he was a prolific writer. And for him, the solution for the Muslim world to deal with challenges like imperialism was for unity. So we see here this book that was written about him. I highly recommend it, Islamic Response to Imperialism, Political and Religious Writings of Sayyid Jamal ad-Din al-Afghani. So he promoted both Sharia law and the political unity of the Islamic world. And so with his writings, he became incredibly popular by the late 19th century. He also traveled around a lot across the region. He visited mosques and schools, preaching his message. And when he reached Egypt, he would eventually create a new newspaper in 1884. And the name of this newspaper was Al-Urwa al-Wuthqa, which means the ties that bind us, specifically the ties that bind the Islamic world. And he used this newspaper to promote his Islamist ideology. He was also hypercritical of not only the Europeans, but of the Ottoman sultans that were engaged in the Tanzimat reforms, the pro-Western reforms that were aimed to develop the empire. So he had a lot of problems with those reforms, specifically those that promoted secularism. He also supported anti-colonial revolts. So he was a political agitator. He wasn't just promoting ideas. He was encouraging people to form social movements, to protest, and even to rebel. So that Arabi revolt we talked about 2 classes ago in Egypt, that revolt against growing British influence in Egypt in 1879, this was in part inspired not only by liberal social movement ideas, but the ideas of people like Jamal ad-Din Afghani. So he had a great effect on a lot of social movements. And all the way up until the present, there are many Islamists that have used modern media, social movement activity to promote their causes, and sometimes have even engaged in revolution. Now, not all Islamists, though, were encouraging aggressive political action. Some were more quiet and really focused on the long term in education in order to make reforms. And one of the most famous of these reformers was Muhammad Abda. He was, just like Jamal ad-Din Afghani, he was part of the ulama, he was a religious scholar, and he spent a lot of time in Egypt throughout the course of his life. Unlike Jamal ad-Din Afghani, who was a Shia, though, Muhammad Abda was a Sunni Sufi Muslim. He was someone who was much more open to the West, someone who was a bit more tolerant of the spread of ideas coming from Europe. And so he was often known what is called an Islamic modernist. He's someone who thought that it was critical that if the Islamic world was to survive, they were going to have to adopt a lot of ideas from Europe and the United States. They were going to have to adopt the scientific method. They were going to have to adopt modern schools. They were going to have to adopt modern mathematics, right? So this is a clear rejection of Salafism. It's a rejection of the Salafists that emerged in the 13th century, right, as the golden age of Islam was coming to an end. So he was calling for the return of mathematics, the return of science to the Islamic world. So he was very big in terms of promoting education, while at the same time staying true to one's Islamic values. So he was still preaching Islam, right? He believed in those values, but he felt like that Muslims needed to become more open-minded and adopt to the present. And so this was a more pacifist approach. And in fact, he traveled to a lot of schools throughout the Middle East. He began to preach for the creation of book clubs. And one of the most important societies he founded was the Society for the Revival of Arabic Literature. And in fact, it wasn't just liberals who were promoting the Nehda, the Arab Renaissance in the late 19th century. It was also a lot of Islamist scholars. And so in places like Beirut, Cairo, Istanbul, in Tunis, and elsewhere throughout the region, we begin to see these reformers promoting, these Islamist ideas, but within a modern context. And so he's promoting mass literacy amongst the public, not just a small class of religious scholars. Now, his big counterpoint during this era, and arguably his, biggest critic, was Muhammad Rashid Rida, another scholar who spent a lot of time in Egypt. But unlike Muhammad Abda, he was a Salafist, right? Someone who was a traditionalist who believed that we have to go back to the time of our ancestors, the Prophet Muhammad. He was by far, out of these three scholars, the most anti-European in terms of the ideas that were coming there, and he rejected secularism completely. And he was very distrustful of European institutions and educational institutions. He called for the return of the caliphate. So he was not in favor of democracy. He was in favor of the return of the caliphate and traditional Sharia law. And so in contrast, a lot of scholars like Muhammad Abda, they were more open to democracy, more open to this idea that, there's this tradition of consensus within the early Islamic community. We should adopt democratic rule. Whereas Muhammad Rida, he was more in favor of the caliphate, of a monarchy, and the imposition of Sharia. And like Jamal al-Din Afghani, he promoted social movement activism and anti-colonial revolt. So he was an agitator, and he was someone as well that got chased around a lot by colonial authorities throughout the course of his life. And later on, his ideas would eventually, towards the end of his life, have an impact on the formation of an organization called the Muslim Brotherhood that would be formed by another activist called Hassan al-Banna. We'll talk about that in a future lecture. So Muhammad Rashid Rida, he was opposed to liberalism. He saw it as a threat to Islamic identity. And so here, just a look at these two individuals, Muhammad Abda and Muhammad Rashid Rida. And part of showing you these images is to really hammer home the point that pictures can be deceiving, images can be deceiving. Both of these individuals are dressed in traditional garb, right? They're wearing the galabiya, they're wearing those turbans, signifying that they are members of the scholarly class of ulama. They both have long beards, right? So indicating they're married Muslim men that are conservative. But the individual on the left was very much more open-minded to modernity in terms of the embrace of science and modern education and even democracy, whereas the man on the right was closed off to those things. Muhammad Rashid Rida was not in support of those type of reforms. So not all of these Islamists thought alike. All right, so what type of impact did this have on the Islamic world in the late 1800s, on the Ottoman Empire and other regions? Well, to talk about the most important impact, we're going to focus on a very important Ottoman sultan who would declare himself caliph in 1878, Abdul Hamid II. Now, if you remember, this guy was actually put into power in 1876 following a constitutional revolution in the Ottoman Empire. The young Ottomans, within the Sultan's military, overthrew Sultan Abdulaziz in 1876 and instituted a democracy. They created a new parliament with elections. They created a constitution that limited the power of the Sultan. But here's the thing, that democracy only lasted 2 years. It didn't last very long, unfortunately, for the Ottomans. What led to the collapse of this democracy? Well, part of it was opposition from Islamists, right? So many Islamists were not in favor of a constitution. They wanted, for example, the sultans to declare themselves caliphs and take control and unite the Islamic world. Now, on top of that as well, there were things happening in the Ottoman Empire that were making it very unstable for democracy to function. For one, there was a lot of conflict and instability in the Balkans within the Ottoman Empire. This is a diverse area of the Ottoman Empire that had a lot of Christian minorities. They were receiving a lot of help, these Christian minorities, from the Russians to rebel against the Ottomans. Groups like the Serbs, the Bulgarians, the Romanians were trying to declare their independence, just like the Greeks had done back in the 1820s. And on top of this as well, the Russians were taking more territory from the Ottoman Empire, along with helping Christian separatists. So as this instability grew and violence grew throughout the Ottoman Empire, this new democracy did not last long. And so what happened is that new sultan that was put into power by the young Ottomans, Sultan Abdulhamid, he decides to suspend the constitution in 1878. Now, of course, the liberals were very angry with him. So in order to drum up a base of support, he declares himself as caliph. He's actually the first Ottoman sultan to do this. Remember, a caliph claims to be the rightful successor to the Prophet Muhammad and the only true leader of the Islamic world. Previous sultans, these Turkish rulers, right, had not made this claim, but he's going to come out and say, I am the true leader of the Islamic world. And he's also going to return to the absolute monarchy. He's going to suspend the parliaments. So what we see here is that modernity enters the Middle East in a very uneven and oftentimes violent and inconsistent way. And so, of course, he is going to call for Islamic unity to stop European aggression. He's going to reverse some of those Tanzimat reforms. He's going to get rid of a lot of those secular reforms that some of his predecessors engaged in. And he's going to call for more aggression against the British and French. So this guy was opposed to democracy and secularism, right? So he's going to go in a different direction here. And in the process, he is going to start to move away from the British and the French, right? So, and what he's going to start to do is make an alliance with an emerging country in Europe, Germany. Now, at this time in history, Germany had actually just united as a country. Back in 1870 to 1871, Otto von Bismarck, a very famous Prussian general, united all of Germany. And Germany was rapidly industrializing. They were becoming a superpower overnight. And Abdulhamid decided this would be a good opportunity to try to get out of the yoke of the British, get out from under the umbrella of British rule, and to make an alliance with this emerging German nation. At the time, the Ottomans owed a lot of money to the British and the French, so they sought a way to make a new alliance. And so what happened is the Germans, they start to give a lot of loans to the Ottoman Empire. They start to invest in their military as well as their railways. Later in the 1890s, they're going to help the Ottoman Empire gain access to the world's first automatic weapons, the Gatling gun. Automatic weapons are firearms that can, if you hold down the trigger, right, it will spit out hundreds of bullets within a very short span of time. Now, of course, since he's reversing these secular reforms, he actually begins to use a lot of violence to suppress religious minorities, particularly those with ties to Russia. So the violence starts to increase here. And this is kind of the irony here. You would think the introduction of modernity would lead to more religious equality, right? And would lead to better governance, but it actually does the opposite. It actually intensified the conflict between religious groups in the Ottoman Empire. It made problems worse. And the worst of this violence took place against a Christian minority known as the Armenians. They are found in now what is northeast Anatolia. They speak this language called Armenian. They are mainly an Orthodox Christian community. And during the late 1800s, they attempted to rebel against the Ottoman Empire with the support of Russian arms. And eventually what happened is the Ottoman Empire starts to crack down in 1894, and mass violence was committed against Armenians. And it will increase by the time we get to World War I. So it is known, this event, as the Armenian Genocide. Over 1 million Armenian Christians were killed. It is important to note that the Turks do deny that this genocide took place. And, they point out that mass violence also took place against Muslims in the Balkans, which of course is true. But There was mass violence committed against Armenian Christians as well. Over 1 million people were killed. Armenians lost most of their lands, and they were forced, most of them, to become refugees. And so here's just a map just looking at where the Armenians were located. This is the heart of the Ottoman Empire. Seeing here, here's Istanbul, and we see here Anatolia. And most of the Armenians were located in northeast Anatolia. They're going to be forced as refugees to go east under Russian rule here, or to travel farther south into Syria and Lebanon. So this was really a horrifying event, and it's really going to foreshadow a lot of the massacres that are going to take place during the world wars. And so part of what made these massacres, what made the violence so much worse during the era, was the emergence of modern technology such as machine guns. We see to the right here. As you can see, you feed the magazine into the gun and it just spits out bullets, right? And it made warfare far more deadly. Now, to the left here, just pointing this out, this is Sultan Abdul Hamid II. This book here, The Last Khalifa, The Last Caliph, talks about his experiences and his life, as well as how he became the Caliph of the Ottoman Empire. Now, here's the thing, though. Just because the Islamists, right, they take over this empire under Sultan Abdul Hamid doesn't mean that the liberals go away. The liberals are going to continue to influence politics in the region. In fact, under the reign of Abdul Hamid, a group of liberals are going to found a secret organization called the Young Turks to resist Islamists. And this is another important point about political Islam. It doesn't exist in a vacuum, okay? It exists in contention with modern liberal movements, promoting secularism as well as democracy, as well as in opposition to European imperialism. Now, who are the Young Turks? These individuals were a quote-unquote liberal secret society that formed in 1889. Now, I put liberal in quotes here because these individuals were a little more pessimistic than the young Ottomans about their future success. And they felt that before democracy could be enacted, the population needed to become cultured, right? They needed to become well-educated in European values and in secularism before true democracy could be had. So while they did promote the overthrow of Sultan Abdul Hamid's caliphate, they at the same time realized that a lot of changes would need to be made before true democracy would emerge. So these individuals, they formed this secret society, these underground clubs and organizations in Istanbul and elsewhere, calling for the overthrow of this individual. And so just like the liberals that we talked about last class, they promoted secularism and modernization. And they promoted a single party dictatorship to first modernize the culture, right? So their idea was they were going to overthrow this caliph, institute a single party dictatorship that would rule over the country, and they would promote modern reforms such as mass education. And then once the population was well educated enough, we could then allow other parties to compete, right? And we could create a democracy. Now, at the same time, and this is another thing that makes the Young Turks very different from the young Ottomans we talked about last class, they were not in favor of ethnic or linguistic diversity. They felt that what went wrong with the young Ottomans in the first constitutional era in the Ottoman Empire was that they were promoting diversity. And this idea, an Ottoman Empire with many languages and religions could exist side by side. They felt this was not possible. Instead, they wanted to promote a single language in what was left of the Ottoman Empire, the Turkish language, at the expense of groups such as the Arabs, the Armenians, the Kurds, and other linguistic minorities. Furthermore, they felt like secularism was needed, right? They, couldn't have Christians, Muslims, or other religious groups influencing the politics of the state. Religion needed to stay out of politics. And so they wanted to eliminate all other languages and ideologies from the empire. And so, in many ways, this was a response to the emergence of Islamism and the failures of the first constitutional era. And this movement, as well, is going to be far less tolerant and far more violent than the young Ottomans. And eventually, they're going to succeed in 1908 with overthrowing Abd al-Hamid II in a revolution in 1908. So, this movement did eventually come to power in much the same way as the young Ottomans came to power back in 1876. And they're going to lead what is called the second constitutional era. It's not going to last very long because World War II is going to come and destroy what is left of the empire. But for 10 years, they did rule over Turkey, and they did create a single-party dictatorship called the Committee of Union and Progress. So we see this word progress and union here, indicating that, we're going to have union first in education and progress before we fully open up to democracy. Like the liberals before them, they did enact reforms, but they didn't allow competitive elections. Now, they didn't completely get rid of the Sultan. They kept him as a kind of symbolic figurehead, a constitutional monarch, kind of the role that the monarchy fills in Great Britain today. Their role is just to, go out and wave to crowds and symbolically represent the state. But the Sultan no longer had power in the country. In fact, the Sultan would not have power ever again in the Ottoman Empire. And they engaged in severe repression of both Islamists as well as non-Turkish minorities, right? This is the death knell of the Ottoman Empire. It's collapsing, right? They're engaging in a lot of oppression of different ethnic groups throughout the empire. And this was the COP's leader. His name was Ahmed Riza. Very prominent middle class, intellectual, well-educated, served in the Ottoman bureaucracy. And we could see here it's these middle class reformers in Istanbul that supported really this young Turkish nationalism. Now, as you can imagine, Arabs, that are well-educated, they're going to oppose this very strongly. And you're going to see why this is going to have a big impact on world history. Now, just one last thing before I leave you guys. This process of modernity didn't just impact the Ottoman Empire within the Middle East. It impacted many other parts of the Islamic world. It impacted the Sultanate of Morocco. It impacted the various provinces of the Ottoman Empire. And of course, it impacted Persia, which at the time in the 19th century was ruled by this dynasty called the Khazars. Very much like the Ottoman Empire, they would be influenced by, for example, defensive developmentalism. This dynasty would adopt modern reforms. They would try to invest in a modern military. They would take out loans from Europe. They would try to build up their bureaucracy. They would build roads and bridges and railways with the money that they borrowed. However, just like the problems with defensive developmentalism in the Ottoman Empire, by taking out all of these loans, they would grow severely in debt. Furthermore, these monarchs in the late 19th century would not engage in democratization, right? So while they were engaging in modern reforms, building new schools and universities, they would not open up to democracy. And because of this, a new middle class is going to emerge in Iran that is going to start to set up newspapers. They're going to start to set up book clubs and social movement activity. You're going to see the emergence of both liberal social movements and Islamist social movements in Iran at the very same time it's happening in the Ottoman Empire. And these social movements are going to call for change. They're going to call for the elimination of any European influence on Iran. They're also going to call as well for the elimination of this absolute monarchy in the country, right? Many of them are going to call for democratization. Now, what spurred on these reforms, the defensive developmentalism and the emergence of liberalism, was just like in the Ottoman Empire, the spread of liberal values to Iran. okay, and European imperialism. At the time in the late 1800s, the Russians were expanding from Central Asia and they were conquering as well this Caucasus region. If you see on this map where Georgia is located, they were starting to expand south. If you see here where it says the Uzbeks, the Russians were also expanding south here, and the British were expanding from the west here and from the north. They had conquered the Indian subcontinent, the British in the 19th century, and they were expanding into Afghanistan. And so, thus, just like the Ottoman Empire, the Europeans were really closing in on all sides. And so thus we get this defensive developmentalism and these social movements calling for reforms. And just like the Ottoman Empire, these reforms would fail to stop the coming of European imperialism. Okay. Now, with that said, there was a brief period in Iran of a constitutional revolution, just like in the Ottoman Empire. In 1905, liberal social movements overthrew the monarchy, established for a very short period of time a democracy, and they tried to institute a democratic government, a constitutional monarchy, a monarch but with an elected legislature. Now, unfortunately, this government did not last long, very much like in the Ottoman Empire. But this time, it would be the European imperialists that would put an end to it. Just a couple of short years later, the British and the Russians would invade Iran. And their big reason is they were scared they would lose access to the country's emerging oil industry. During the period of defensive development in Iran, oil pipelines were built. They were beginning to export oil to other parts of the globe. And so the Europeans had a growing interest in this country. And eventually, by 1911, they were going to secure the northern and southern halves of this country and actually occupy Iran for several years until after World War I. So just to summarize here, it was not just the Ottoman Empire that was exposed to modernity, that engaged in defensive developmentalism, that saw social movements emerge promoting liberalism and Islamism. Other parts of the Islamic world, such as Iran, would experience this as well, okay? All right, so that does it for today's lecture. Thanks, guys, for tuning in and listening to my spiel here. Feel free to join my next lecture when we're going to talk about World War I and the destruction of the Ottoman Empire, as well as the Sykes-Picot Agreement. So I'll see you guys next time.